Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of our Magnum OPUS Podcast. Today we're going to pick up exactly where we left off last week, which was Advanced Music Theory Part 1. So if you haven't caught up on that yet, you might not want to listen to this episode unless you're pretty far along in theory and think you can jump in. We started last week by talking about the different individual notes of the diatonic scale. And so we talked about the first note of a scale is called the tonic, the second note is called the supertonic, third is the mediant, then we have the subdominant, dominant, submediant, leading tone, and then of course we go back to the tonic again. So, just a quick recap. When you start and build a chord on your tonic, it is a major chord. How do we know that? Because for a major chord, you have to have 4 half steps between your first and middle note, and then 3 half steps from that middle note to the top note. So if we build a chord in C major, well, we did D last time, so let's build a chord in D major. First note is D, we count up 4 half steps, D sharp, E, F natural, and then F sharp. That middle note is F sharp, and then 3 half steps from F sharp, we have G, G sharp, and A. So for the tonic chord, it is major because that first chord is D, F sharp, and A. We went all the way through first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth notes, and then we got to the chord built on the leading tone, and we learned that it was a diminished chord. And this is kind of where we left off. We wanted to figure out what the heck a diminished chord was. So let's go to D major again. The leading tone is C sharp. It's the last note right before D. And then let's build a chord off of C sharp. So first of all, what we do, we build the chord in the key, so C sharp, we skip the next note, which would be D and E. E is our middle note, C sharp, E natural, and then we skip F sharp, we go to G. So the chord is C sharp, E, and G. And of course, we walked through the steps there. We figured out if it was major or minor. If it's minor, there are 3 half steps between the first note and then the middle note. And then there would be 4 half steps from the middle note to the top note. So if it was minor, we start in C sharp, half step up is D, D sharp, E. But then we have to go 4 half steps for this to be minor. So then that middle note is E. It would be F natural, F sharp, G natural, and then G sharp. But of course that top note is not G sharp, it's G natural. So this turns it into a diminished chord. Now what the heck is a diminished chord? Great question. A major chord is of course a chord that's built off of those half steps. From the first note to that second note there are 4 half steps, and that second note to the third note there are 3 half steps. A minor, you kind of flip them. The first note to the third note is going to be 3 half steps, and then that third note to the fifth note is 4 half steps. A diminished chord, first to the third note is 3 half steps, and then that third to that last note is 3 half steps again. Now what's the purpose of a diminished chord? A major chord can set the key for a major key. It's something that gives us a little bit more peppiness, a little bit happier. A minor key or a minor chord sets the tone that it's a little bit more sad. Maybe it's a little bit more depressing, but again, we can get into how all that stuff works in a different episode. A diminished chord builds tension. A diminished chord has a lot of crunch to it. There's a lot of all these intervals are not necessarily pleasant to the ear. If we take a look really quick, let's do it a little bit easier. Let's build a diminished chord off of C. So major would be C, E, G. Minor would be C, E flat, G natural. A diminished chord would be C, E flat, G flat. In music, there is something called a tritone. And a tritone is what cuts the octave directly in half. And of course, an octave is when we start on a note and we go up or down, and we pretty much go up far enough so that that musical note repeats. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. The letter C just repeated itself. We've traveled an octave. You can go backwards as well, C down to C. This is really, you've played hundreds of octaves so far just on a string instrument. If you cut the octave exactly in half, you get what's called a tritone. Half the distance from C to C would be F sharp. And for my enharmonic buddies out there, they know that F sharp is the same as G flat, which would of course be that note in the diminished chord. C, E flat, and G flat. The tritone is from a long time ago, back in the 1600s and 1700s, when it was sort of first kind of being used in popular music. It was known as the devil's interval, because it was that ugly and that harsh that people thought anytime you played that, you were inviting the devil into your instrument. So think about that. Now, what a diminished chord does is, again, it builds tension. So if you play those three notes on a piano, for example, C, E flat, and G flat, you can't necessarily sit there and just be comfortable with what you're playing. You have to play another chord to give it a sense of finality. If you play a major chord, C, E, G, this can be home base. You can start a piece here, you can end a piece here, this chord can land somewhere in the middle of the piece. If you play a diminished chord, C, E flat, G flat, you can't sit there. You can't necessarily start a piece on a diminished chord. You definitely can't end a piece in traditional Western music. There are composers out there that have done that to interesting results, but if you're looking for a classical composition, you cannot end a piece on a diminished chord because it does not have a sense of finality. So why is this important? Let's backtrack now all the way back to our scale degrees. So again, we're going to talk about the tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, supertonic, leading tone, and then tonic again. Those are our 7 scale degrees, 8 if you count the tonic twice. This is really important now to know why, if you build a chord off of your tonic, it's major, and if you build a chord off of your supertonic, it's minor. When you are composing, we go through what's called chordal changes. You can't necessarily just play a piece with the chord of the tonic. Let's pick D again, because that's our friendly key. If you just play D, F sharp, and G over and over again, and maybe you flip it up and play G, D, and then F sharp, it gets boring. People want to hear something new or something different. So what composers do is they travel to different chords. They might start on the tonic and have lots of notes that are D, F sharp, and A. And then they travel to, how about the 5th? They travel to the mediant, which remember starts on A. So now we have A, C sharp, E. So now we start from D, F sharp, A, we play that for a little while, and then maybe 4 or 8 bars later we travel to A, and we play notes that are A, C sharp, or E. That's still a major chord, so it keeps the same tonality. You can play those 2 chords, very, very common to play those 2, but it still sounds major. If you're thinking, you know what, I want to make this piece sad for a little while, maybe let's go to the 2 chord. Let's build notes off of E, G natural, and B. Remember, this is minor because the distance from E to G is 3 half steps. It would be major if it was E to G sharp, 4 half steps. And then maybe after we play minor for a little while, then we want to go back to major. We can go back to the 5 chord. Chordal progressions are incredibly important if you want to be a composer. These are very, very popular and very, very common progressions, transitions from one chord to another that kind of build the skeleton to your piece. For example, Johann Sebastian Bach, who I haven't done a podcast yet, but he's on the list, composed zillions and zillions of pieces of music that were essentially hymnals or chorales, where all 4 parts, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, moved together. They could be played very easily on the piano. Maybe the tenor has some 8th notes and the soprano has some 16th notes, but they are all built together as chords. And if you study these chords, he is following a very strict pattern, but that's what makes it sound so beautiful. Going back a little bit, when composers think about their chordal progressions, it's very, very important to think about what notes go to where. So why is it popular to go from the tonic to the mediant, from the 1 chord to the 5 chord? Because the 5 chord actually shares one of the notes in the tonic. Remember, the tonic is D, F sharp, A. Well, the 5th chord is A, C sharp, E. They share A. So it's really easy for your ear just to shift over when you have one of the same pitches being played. So that's kind of nice. That's a plus there. Additionally, the 5 chord really, really likes to go back to 1 Because it has the leading tone in it. And remember, we talked about in Music Theory Advanced Part 1, the leading tone loves to resolve up to the tonic again. So what's the leading tone? It's the 7th note of the scale. Where is it in our chord? A, C sharp, E. We know our tonic is D, so that leading tone is going to be C sharp. So if you play a 5, you play a dominant chord, A, C sharp, E, and then you go back to 1, you play D, F sharp, A. Well, that sounds kind of final. That sounds like a very natural progression. When we play a diminished chord, which is a chord built off of, in this case, it would be a chord built off of the leading tone, so C sharp, E natural, and G. Now we just have a very, very clashy chord that can actually resolve in a couple of different ways. Now, yes, that leading tone has to resolve up to the tonic, so D has to be in there, but you don't actually have to go to the tonic, because the tonic has D in it, D, F sharp, A, but remember there's a couple other chords that have the tonic. Let's look at the 4 chord, the submediant. So that's D, E, F sharp, G, a chord built on G. What are the 3 notes in the G chord? G, B natural, and D natural. Well, there we go. The 4 chord has our tonic in it as well. So now we can resolve from a diminished chord into the 4 chord if we want. This is just an example of some of the way chord progressions work. But the point of this diminished chord is it just builds tension. So if we go back and we want to write a new chord progression, we start on 1, D, F sharp, A, beautiful. We can go almost to any other chord that we want to, but it's perhaps easiest to go to 5 because it shares that same note. It shares A. So then we go to 5, A, C sharp, E. And where do we want to go now? Well, we could go to the 7th chord because C sharp is again that shared note, but also 5 really wants to resolve back to 1, so we could go back to 1. Let's pretend we go to the 7th chord. Now we have C sharp, E, G. Now it's very, very crunchy. It's not a minor chord, it's a diminished chord, so there's that ugly interval of the tritone, but it can very easily resolve to the 1 chord again. Now, let's talk really quickly about why this is so important in composing music and bring it full circle. When you want to compose a piece, sometimes the first thing you do is pick a key, sometimes the first thing you do is find a melody that you really, really like and go from there. But if, for example, we've picked a key, let's pick D major. Now, if we want to build a chorale or any piece of music, we need a chord progression. Something that sounds nice, something that has wonderful progressions to it and just feels very natural. This is where we go. So we start on 1, and then we might want to go to 5, and then maybe to 6, and then to 2, then to 5, and then to 1. We find a really nice chord progression system. And if you want to know why that works, check out next week's episode for our 3rd and final part into advanced music theory. We talk about why these chord progressions are so common, and we talk about why these are some of the best ones out there for Western music. We always got to put that little caveat in there, because you can always compose your own music. You don't necessarily have to follow these progressions. You can pick a melody you like and write a bass line and everything's golden. This is one of the most taught ways to compose music. So thank you everybody so much for listening. I hope you learned something, even if it wasn't necessarily easy to understand. And as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you